A 6-year-old boy is lying on a bed soaked through with sweat. His skin is the color of candle wax. His breathing sounds like paper tearing. A man sits beside him, holding the boy's hand with both of his own, and the man's lips are moving but no sound is coming out. He's praying, but he ran out of words hours ago. The town doctor left that morning. He stood in the doorway, wiped his hands on his coat, and said the sentence every parent dreads more than anything on earth. There's nothing more I can do. The boy's name is Caleb. His father's name is Emmett Shaw. And what happens over the next 48 hours is going to test whether this frontier settlement deserves to call itself civilized. But here's the part that turns this from a sad story into an infuriating one. A woman is going to save this boy's life, and this settlement is going to try to kill her for it. 3 days before the doctor gave up, Caleb had been fine, running around the yard, chasing the chickens, doing the things 6-year-old boys do on a frontier ranch. Then the fever came fast. By nightfall, his temperature was so high that when Emmett put a wet cloth on his forehead, the cloth was warm within seconds. Emmett rode to town for the doctor. Dr. Crane was a decent man who did his best with almost nothing. On the frontier in the 1860s, a doctor's kit contained whiskey, laudanum, a bone saw, and whatever herbs he'd managed to learn about through trial and error. Survival rates for serious fevers were grim. In remote territories, fewer than half the children who developed high fevers survived them. The doctor tried cold compresses, tried a willow bark tea, tried everything in his limited arsenal. Nothing worked. Some fevers break on their own, the doctor said. Some don't. I'm sorry, Emmett. Emmett didn't sleep that night. He sat beside Caleb and watched the boy's chest rise and fall, terrified that each breath would be the last. By dawn, Caleb's breathing had grown worse. His lips were turning blue. That's when Emmett made a decision that would change everything. He saddled his horse and rode east, into Apache territory. Now, Emmett Shaw was not a man who had dealings with the Apache. He was a rancher, quiet, kept to himself. But he'd heard stories from traders about an Apache healer who lived in the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains, a woman named Nayeli who could cure fevers that white doctors couldn't touch. Some traders called it medicine. Others called it something darker. Emmett didn't care what anyone called it. His boy was dying. He rode for 6 hours. When he reached the Apache camp, he dismounted, left his rifle on the saddle, and walked in with his hands visible. Warriors intercepted him immediately, spears leveled, voices sharp. Emmett spoke the only Apache phrase he knew, taught to him by a trader years ago. It roughly translated to, "I need help. My child is sick." The warriors didn't lower their spears, but a woman stepped forward from behind the group. She was maybe 40, with calm dark eyes and hands stained green from grinding plants. Nayeli. She listened to Emmett describe Caleb's symptoms. She asked questions through a warrior who spoke some Spanish. How many days? Does the boy cough? Is there a rash? Does his neck feel stiff when he tilts his head forward? Then she nodded once and went to her wickiup. She came out with a leather pouch filled with dried plants and a small clay pot of something that smelled sharp and bitter. She looked at Emmett and said one word in Spanish. Vamos, let's go. An elder in the camp, an old woman who had watched the exchange, called out to Nayeli as she mounted a horse. The words were in Apache, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning. Nayeli looked back, nodded once, and rode out with Emmett toward his ranch. They arrived after dark. Caleb's condition had worsened. His breathing was ragged and irregular. Emmett's neighbor, a woman named Martha, who'd been watching the boy, looked up in shock when an Apache woman walked through the door. Nayeli didn't waste time on explanations. She knelt beside Caleb and pressed her fingers against his throat, his wrists, and behind his ears. Then she opened her pouch. What followed was a process that Emmett watched with a mixture of desperate hope and complete ignorance. Nayeli brewed a tea from osha root, a plant that Apache healers had used for generations to reduce fevers and fight respiratory infections. She ground the leaves of a creosote bush into a paste and rubbed it on the boy's chest. Creosote was one of the most powerful natural antiseptics in the Southwest desert, effective against bacterial and viral infections long before Western medicine had those categories. She also used willow bark, The same ingredient the doctor had tried, but she prepared it differently. She combined it with two other plants that Emmett couldn't identify, creating a compound that worked far more effectively than the bark alone. Modern science would later validate what Apache healers already knew. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the chemical base of aspirin, but the other plants Nayeli added likely contained complementary compounds that enhanced absorption. Through the night, Nayeli stayed beside the boy. She reapplied the chest paste every 2 hours. She held the tea to his lips and tilted his head to help him swallow. She sang quietly, and Emmett didn't know if the singing was medicine or prayer or both, but he didn't interrupt. By dawn, Caleb's breathing had steadied. By midday, his color had returned. By the following morning, he opened his eyes, looked at Nayeli, and said, "I'm thirsty." Emmett dropped to his knees and wept. His boy was alive. Nayeli prepared several more doses of the medicine and showed Emmett how to administer them. She spoke quietly to Caleb in Apache, and the boy smiled, not understanding the words, but understanding the gentleness. "He will recover fully," she told Emmett through the gestures and the few Spanish words they shared. 2 more days of the tea. Keep him warm. Emmett tried to pay her. He held out coins, offered horses, offered anything. Nayeli shook her head. She pointed at Caleb, then at her own heart, then at the sky. The meaning was clear. Healing a child was its own reward. Emmett rode out with Nayeli to escort her back toward Apache territory. He was gone for 3 hours. That was enough time for everything to go wrong. Martha, the neighbor, had watched the entire treatment. She'd seen the strange plants, heard the singing, watched an Apache woman perform rituals over a white child. And Martha was afraid, not malicious. Afraid. She went to town and told people what she'd seen. By the time she finished talking, the story had mutated. An Apache witch had been brought into a settler's home. She'd performed dark rituals over a sleeping child. She'd chanted spells. The boy was under some kind of influence. Now, this kind of accusation wasn't unusual on the frontier. Documented cases exist of indigenous healers being accused of witchcraft when they treated white patients. The fear wasn't rational, but it was real. Settlers who couldn't explain how traditional remedies worked often defaulted to the only framework they had. If it's not Christian medicine, it must be the devil's work. Apache healing traditions, which combined plant pharmacology with spiritual practice, looked deeply foreign to people who associated prayer exclusively with church pews and steeples. If you're watching this and your blood is already starting to heat up, subscribe. Because what these people do next is the part that made me stop and stare at the screen. By late afternoon, a group of 15 men had gathered at the edge of town. Some were genuine believers in witchcraft. Others were men who hated the Apache and saw an opportunity. A rancher named Dalton Briggs, a man who'd lost cattle to Apache raids 2 years earlier, led the group. They rode to Emmett's ranch. Emmett was still gone, escorting Nayeli. Martha was inside with Caleb, who was sleeping peacefully, his fever broken, his color healthy. The men dismounted. Briggs walked inside without knocking. He looked at the sleeping boy, saw the clay pot of medicine beside the bed, and picked it up. "This is what she used," he said. Another man sniffed it. "Smells like the devil." They waited. Emmett returned just before sunset, alone. He'd said goodbye to Nayeli at the territory line and watched her ride east. But Nayeli hadn't made it back to her camp. Briggs had sent 3 men to intercept her while Emmett was still riding home. They caught her on the trail. They tied her hands. They dragged her horse back toward the settlement. By the time Emmett walked through his door and found Caleb safe and sleeping, the mob had Nayeli tied to the hanging tree at the south end of town. Emmett didn't know. He kissed his son's forehead. He sat down. He closed his eyes for the first time in 3 days. Then Martha told him. "They took the Apache woman," she said. Her voice was shaking. "Emmett, I'm sorry. I only told them what I saw. I didn't think they'd—" Emmett was on his horse before she finished the sentence. He reached the hanging tree in 12 minutes. The scene was everything ugly about the frontier compressed into a single clearing. 15 men, torches, a rope over a branch, and Nayeli standing with her hands bound, looking at the faces around her with an expression that wasn't fear. It was disappointment, like she'd known this would happen and had come anyway. Emmett pushed through the crowd. Briggs stepped in front of him. "Stay out of this, Emmett. The witch cursed your boy." "She saved my boy. Caleb is alive because of her." "That's exactly what a curse looks like at first," another man said. Emmett looked at the faces around him. Some of these men had visited his ranch. Some had shared meals with him. One had helped him dig the grave when Ellie died. And now they were going to hang the woman who'd prevented him from digging another one. "You're going to kill the person who saved a child's life," Emmett said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the clearing. "And you're going to do it because you're afraid of what you don't understand." Briggs laughed. "She's Apache. She performed rituals. The law. The law says nothing about healing a sick boy." Emmett stepped closer. "But it says plenty about hanging an unarmed woman without a trial." The crowd shifted. Some men looked at the ground. Others didn't. Then a voice cut through the tension. A small voice. "She made me better." Everyone turned. Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing. He'd followed his father on. Barefoot, still in his night clothes, still pale from 3 days of fever. Martha stood behind him, having failed to keep him inside. The boy walked through the crowd. Full-grown men stepped aside for a 6-year-old. Caleb walked directly to Niley and took her bound hand. "She made me better," he said again. "She sang to me. She's nice." The silence that followed was different from the mob's earlier silence. This one had shame in it. Emmett drew his knife, not toward anyone. He walked to Nayeli and cut her bonds. The rope fell to the ground. Briggs started to speak, but the man beside him put a hand on his arm. "Dalton, enough." One by one, the torches lowered. One by one, men turned and walked away. Not because they'd changed their minds about Apache people, not because they'd suddenly understood the medicine, but because a 6-year-old boy standing barefoot in the dirt had made it impossible to pretend this was anything other than what it was, cruelty dressed up as righteousness. Emmett escorted Nayeli away from the tree. His horse carried her while he walked beside, holding the reins. They didn't speak. There wasn't language enough between them for what needed to be said. At the territory line, Nayeli dismounted. She looked at Emmett. Then she reached into her pouch and pressed a small bundle of dried herbs into his hand. She pointed at Caleb, then at the herbs, then mimicked the motion of brewing tea. "If the fever returns," she said in Spanish, "this will stop it." Then she turned and rode into the darkness. And Emmett stood on the line between two worlds, holding medicine in one hand and his son's future in the other. Here's the part of this story that the mob would never know. 6 months later, Dalton Briggs's own daughter fell ill with the same fever. No doctor in the territory could help her. Briggs rode to every settlement within 100 miles. Nothing worked. The girl nearly died. She survived, but barely, and she never fully recovered. A treatment existed that could have saved her completely. It was sitting in a leather pouch in an Apache camp 40 miles east, but Dalton Briggs would never ride east. His pride and his hatred were stronger than his love, and that is the quiet tragedy that no one in that settlement ever spoke about. Emmett never forgot what Nayeli did. He kept the bundle of herbs in a tin box above the kitchen stove. He told Caleb the story every year on the anniversary of the night his fever broke, and every spring he left a package of supplies at the territory line. Flour, salt, ammunition, cloth. He never saw who collected it, but the package was always gone by morning. Some debts on the frontier couldn't be repaid with horses or gold. They could only be honored by remembering. And Emmett Shaw remembered every single day. The suppression of indigenous healing knowledge on the American frontier led to the loss of treatments that modern science has since validated. Plants that Apache healers used for centuries are now studied in laboratories. Compounds they discovered through generations of observation are being patented by pharmaceutical companies. The knowledge was never primitive. The people who carried it were never witches. They were healers, and the frontier punished them for it. Now, the real history of how Apache medicine was systematically destroyed and what modern science is only now rediscovering is a story that changes how you see the entire American West. That story is on screen right now.